The question that changes everything. You're sitting in your car and in the parking lot, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to summon the courage to walk into that building. Maybe it's a job interview where you're underqualified. Maybe it's a doctor's office where you'll get test results. Maybe it's a confrontation you can't avoid any longer. Your mind catalogues every possible way this could go wrong, every person who might oppose you, every obstacle standing in your path. The fear is so tangible you can taste it. Now imagine someone credible, someone you trust completely, leaning into your car window and saying with absolute certainty, the most powerful force in existence is actively working in your favor right now. How would that change what you are about to walk into? This isn't a motivational thought experiment. For believers, this is supposed to be bedrock reality. The Apostle Paul, writing from a Roman prison cell, posed a question that has echoed through 2 millennia. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? We've turned this verse into refrigerator magnet theology, a nice encouragement to pull out when things get tough. But Paul wasn't offering a spiritual pep talk. He was describing a fundamental restructuring of reality. He was pointing to a truth so staggering that once you truly see it, you can't see opposition, fear, or circumstance the same way again. This isn't about believing everything will work out the way you want. It's not about health, wealth, and prosperity. It's about something far more radical, a complete reorientation of what it means to face anything when the Creator of the universe has positioned himself as your advocate. Most of us live in the gap between knowing this verse and experiencing its reality. We've memorized the words. We might even believe they're true in some theological sense. But we don't live like they're true. We calculate our odds based on visible resources, human opposition, and statistical probabilities. We pray for God to help us while simultaneously believing we're probably going to lose. What if the problem isn't that we need more faith, but that we've never truly understood what we're being offered? What if God is for us isn't a hopeful possibility, but an actual description of reality that changes everything the moment we grasp it? This is about more than comfort in hard times. This is about a worldview revolution. By the end of our time together, my hope is that you won't just remember this verse differently. You'll see your circumstances, your opponents, and your future through an entirely different lens. Let's explore why this ancient question from a prison cell might be the most liberating truth you could ever internalize. The theological foundation. What God is for us actually means. Before we can grasp the implications, we need to understand what Paul is actually claiming. The phrase, God is for us, is deceptively simple, but it's packed with theological weight that transforms it from sentiment to bedrock reality. Let's start with that small but crucial preposition, for. In the original Greek, the word is hyper, which carries meanings of on behalf of, in favor of, in place of, and for the sake of. This isn't God casually cheering from the sidelines. This is God as advocate, ally, defender, and substitute. When Paul uses this language, he's invoking the image of someone who has not just taken your side, but has entered into your circumstances, assumed your position, and committed their full resources to your cause. But here's where it gets even more profound. Paul isn't speculating about God's disposition. He's not saying if God decides to be for us or if we can convince God to be for us. The structure of the sentence in Greek presents this as an established fact, a done deal, a settled reality. The if isn't expressing doubt, it's more like saying since or given that. Paul is building an argument on a foundation he considers unshakable. So what makes him so certain? The answer comes in the verses immediately following, He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all. How will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Paul's confidence isn't based on wishful thinking or religious optimism. It's based on the cross. The crucifixion of Jesus is, for Paul, the ultimate proof of concept. It's God putting his money where his mouth is, so to speak. If you want to know whether God is truly, irrevocably, extravagantly for you, look at what it cost him to be on your side. He didn't send a representative. He didn't offer advice. He didn't negotiate terms. He gave his son. In Roman execution, for rebels who weren't even asking for help. This is where we need to distinguish what Paul means from how we often domesticate this truth. This isn't prosperity gospel. God being for us doesn't mean He's committed to making us comfortable, wealthy, or free from suffering. The cross itself demonstrates that God's forness operates on a different plane than our immediate comfort. Jesus' entire earthly life was characterized by opposition, rejection, and ultimately execution. And yet God was for him every step of the way, ultimately vindicating him through resurrection. God being for us means He's committed to our ultimate good, which he defines as conformity to the image of Christ, eternal fellowship with him, and participation in his kingdom purposes. It means positioning every circumstance, every opposition, every trial to serve that end. Nothing touches your life that hasn't first passed through the filter of divine intentionality working for your ultimate benefit. This is grounded in covenant. Throughout Scripture, God binds himself to his people through promises that stake his own character on their fulfillment. He doesn't promise based on our performance. He promises based on his nature. When God says he is for us, he's not expressing a feeling that might change. He's declaring a covenant position that would require him to deny himself, to abandon. Think about the weight of this, the being who holds every atom in existence together, who spoke galaxies into being, who knows the end from the beginning, has looked at you specifically and said, "I'm all in. I'm on your side. My resources are committed to your good. My reputation is tied to your outcome, not because you deserve it, not because you earned it, but because that's who he is and what he determined to do through Christ." This is the foundation. Everything else we're going to explore builds on this theological bedrock. God isn't for you because you're good. God is for you because he's good. And the cross is his signature on that commitment, written in blood, impossible to revoke. The mathematics of divine alliance. Now let's follow Paul's logic to its staggering conclusion. If the premise is true, if God is genuinely, actively, irrevocably for us, then the question, who can be against us? I sent rhetorical optimism. It's a mathematical equation. On one side of the equation, you have opposition, real, tangible, threatening opposition, a hostile boss who seems determined to make your life miserable, a diagnosis that medical science says is terminal, a financial crisis that the numbers say you can't survive, a relationship that's collapsing despite your best efforts, an injustice so systemic you can't imagine how it could ever be made right. These aren't trivial concerns. Paul isn't minimizing them. But on the other side of the equation, you have omnipotence actively working in your favor. And here's where our minds struggle, because we can't actually conceptualize what omnipotence means. We think of God as very powerful, like a superhuman, when the reality is categorically different. God doesn't have power. God is the source of power. All power, everywhere, in every form, derives from him and exists only because he sustains it. So when you're facing opposition, here's the actual equation. Your problem plus all the power in existence working for your good equal to. From God's perspective, the opposition isn't even a factor in the calculation. It's like trying to outweigh infinity on a scale. You could add mountains to one side and it wouldn't budge the needle. The question, who can be against us, isn't asking who might pose a challenge. It's asking who could possibly pose a threat when omnipotence is your ally. But here's where we need to redefine terms, because we often measure winning by earthly, temporary standards. We think God being for us means we'll get the job, the healing, the relationship, the justice we're seeking. And sometimes that happens. But Paul wrote this from prison. He wrote this as a man who had been beaten, shipwrecked, abandoned, and slandered by any conventional measure, Paul was losing constantly, yet Paul saw himself as overwhelmingly victorious because head redefined the playing field. He wasn't asking, who can make my life comfortable? He was asking, who can separate me from God's love? Who can derail God's purposes? Who can prevent God from accomplishing everything he intends in and through my life? And the answer to those questions is absolutely no one. This is where the reality shift happens. When you truly grasp that God is for you, you stop calculating odds based on visible resources. You stop measuring success by earthly outcomes. You start evaluating situations based on a completely different paradigm. Is this circumstance within God's awareness? Yes. Is God's commitment to me affected by this circumstance? No. Can this circumstance ultimately prevent God from accomplishing his good purposes? Absolutely not. Suddenly, the intimidating boss is just a chess piece on a board where God is grandmaster. The diagnosis is real, but it's not determinative of your ultimate story. The financial crisis has real consequences, but it can't bankrupt God's resources on your behalf. The injustice is genuinely wrong, but it's already incorporated into God's plan for setting all things right. This isn't naive optimism. It's not positive thinking. It's a clear-eyed recognition that when you align with an infinite power source that's committed to your good, the equation simply doesn't work the way it appears. The opposition may be formidable by human standards, but it's not even a rounding error in the cosmic calculation. Paul's question deserves to ring in our ears: who can be against us? Not who might challenge us or who might make things difficult, but who can ultimately stand against us when the God of the universe has taken our side. The answer, when you truly do the math, is staggering. Not a single person, circumstance, or power in existence. From head to heart, the psychological transformation here's the problem most of us face. We believe this truth intellectually but don't experience it emotionally. We can affirm that God is for us while simultaneously being paralyzed by anxiety about opposition. We can quote Romans 8:31 while living as though everything depends on our own efforts and limited resources. The gap between theological knowledge and experiential reality can be vast. So how does this truth move from head to heart? How does it transition from a doctrine we affirm to a lived reality that actually changes how we feel and function? First, we need to understand what's happening psychologically when we fail to live in this reality. Most of us operate from what psychologists call an external locus of control. We calculate our well-being based on external factors, other people's opinions, circumstances we can't control, resources we don't have. We're constantly assessing threats and measuring our capacity to respond. This creates chronic anxiety because there are always more threats than we have capacity to handle. When Paul says, if God is for us, who can be against us? He's inviting a radical shift to what we might call a divine locus of control. The fundamental calculation changes from, can I handle this, to, is God still for me in this? It's not that circumstances don't matter, it's that they're no longer the determining factor in your ultimate outcome. This produces a different kind of psychology entirely. Researchers who study resilience have identified that people who weather severe adversity best are those who have what they call a secure base, an unshakable foundation of safety and support they can return to regardless of external chaos. For believers, God's forness is meant to be that secure base, but elevated to an infinite degree. Think about how differently a child behaves when they know their parent is present versus when they feel alone. The same playground that feels adventurous with a parent watching feels terrifying when they believe they're on their own. The parent's presence doesn't eliminate actual dangers, but it fundamentally changes the child's capacity to engage with their environment. They take appropriate risks, they recover from falls faster, they don't interpret every challenge as catastrophic. When you genuinely internalize that God is for you, a similar transformation occurs in how you process threat and opposition. Your nervous system actually responds differently. You're still aware of challenges, but they don't trigger the same cascade of fear and helplessness. Why? Because the ultimate question isn't, can I overcome this, but is God's commitment to me affected by this? This also creates an identity shift. Most of us unconsciously see ourselves as defendants in the cosmic courtroom, constantly trying to justify our existence, prove our worth, and defend ourselves against accusations. We live from a posture of scarcity and defensiveness. But if God is truly for us, we're not defendants, we're the defended. We're not trying to earn advocacy, we already have it from the highest authority. This is qualitatively different from positive thinking or affirmations. Positive thinking says, I'm going to choose to believe things will work out. This truth says, things are already being worked for my good by someone with the power to ensure it, regardless of how they appear. Positive thinking is self-generated hope that can collapse when circumstances overwhelm it. This is an anchored confidence in an external, unchanging reality. The psychological transformation happens as we practice reorienting to this truth. When anxiety rises, instead of immediately strategizing how to fix the situation, we ask, is God still for me in this moment? Has anything about this circumstance changed his commitment? The answer is always no, which allows our nervous system to settle even while we take appropriate action. When opposition emerges, instead of seeing ourselves as alone against threat, we recognize we're partnered with omnipotence. This doesn't mean we'll avoid all harm, but it means we're never ultimately at risk. The real you, the eternal you, cannot be touched by anything that hasn't first been filtered through divine purposes working for your good. This is the journey from knowledge to experience, repeatedly bringing our feelings and circumstances back into alignment with the reality of God's position toward us. It's not instantaneous, it's not formulaic, but it's utterly transformative. And it's available to anyone willing to let this truth migrate from their theology to their neurology. Modern applications. Living the reality shift theology matters because it shapes how we actually live. So what does it look like to operate from the reality that God is for us when facing contemporary challenges? Let's get specific. Facing career and financial uncertainty, you've lost your job, or your industry is collapsing, or you're facing a financial crisis that the spreadsheet says is unsolvable. The anxiety is crushing because your security feels threatened at the most basic level. Living from God is for us doesn't mean ignoring the practical reality or assuming money will magically appear. It means approaching the situation from a different foundation. Instead of my security depends on this job income, the calculation becomes my ultimate security depends on God's commitment to me, which this situation cannot change. God is actively working to use even this circumstance for my good. This produces different action. You still look for work. You still budget. You still take responsible steps. But you do it without the crushing weight of existential panic, because you know you're not navigating this alone, and you're not ultimately at risk. You're freed to make wise decisions rather than desperate ones. You can pass up opportunities that compromise your values because you're not operating from scarcity. You can receive help without shame because you understand God often works through community. More profoundly, you become open to the possibility that this crisis is actually God repositioning you for something better than what you lost. When we truly believe God is for us, we can hold our current circumstances loosely enough to see what He might be doing through them. Navigating relational conflict, you're in a relationship that's deteriorating, a marriage, a friendship, a family connection. The other person seems determined to misunderstand you, or they've betrayed you, or there's a fundamental rupture you can't seem to bridge. The typical response is either people-pleasing desperation, trying to control their opinion through performance, or defensive withdrawal, protecting ourselves by cutting them off. Both responses come from feeling alone in the conflict. But if God is for us, the equation changes. Their approval is no longer your ultimate need. You have divine advocacy. Their opposition can't ultimately harm you because they'd have to go through God to get to you. This creates freedom, freedom to engage honestly without manipulation, freedom to set healthy boundaries without guilt, freedom to pursue reconciliation without compromising yourself, and freedom to accept that some relationships may end without it destroying you. You can say hard truths in love because you're not controlling the outcome. You can apologize without fear because their forgiveness isn't what secures you. You can even absorb some injustice because you know God sees it and will set accounts right in His time. The relationship no longer determines your worth or safety. Dealing with health crises, the diagnosis is serious, the prognosis is uncertain. Your body, which you've taken for granted, has betrayed you, and the medical establishment offers limited hope. Here's where God is for us is most often misunderstood. It doesn't mean God will necessarily heal you. Paul himself asked 3 times for physical healing and received no, because God's purposes were better served through Paul's weakness, but it does mean this illness cannot separate you from God's love or derail His good purposes for you. This creates a radically different relationship with suffering. Instead of experiencing illness as evidence that God has abandoned you or doesn't care, you can ask, how is God for me even in this? What good might He be working that I can't yet see? This isn't spiritual bypassing that denies genuine grief and fear. It's a framework that allows you to experience those emotions without being destroyed by them. You can pursue treatment while also surrendering outcomes. You can be honest about your fear while also resting in ultimate security. You can grieve what you're losing while also remaining open to what you might be gaining in character, in dependence, in testimony, in ways you can't predict. And if healing doesn't come, if the disease progresses, you can face even death itself, knowing that God's forness extends beyond this life into eternity. Death becomes not ultimate defeat, but transition to the fullness of what God has been working toward all along. Confronting injustice and systemic opposition, you're facing racism, sexism, or other forms of systemic oppression, or you're fighting for justice in situations where the powerful seem determined to crush you. The opposition isn't just personal, it's institutional, structural, overwhelming. God is for us doesn't mean passive acceptance of injustice. Look at the prophets. Look at Jesus Himself. God being for people often meant confronting corrupt systems and defending the vulnerable. But it does mean you're not alone in the fight, and ultimate victory isn't determined by who has more power in earthly terms. You can engage in justice work without cynicism or despair, because you know the arc of God's universe truly does bend toward justice. You can absorb setbacks without giving up, because you know temporary losses don't determine the final outcome. You can work for change while also entrusting yourself to God's vindication. This produces activists who are fierce but not bitter, persistent but not burned out, hopeful but not naive. The opposition is real, but it's not determinative. Practical daily practices. How do you maintain this perspective in the mundane grind of daily life? Here are some practices. Morning reorientation, before checking your phone or mentally cataloging your problems. Affirm God is for me today. Every situation I encounter is being worked for my good. Anxiety interruption, when fear rises, pause and ask, has this circumstance changed God's commitment to me? Let the answer settle you before taking action. Opposition reframing, when you encounter resistance, ask, how might God be using even this opposition to accomplish His good purposes? Evening reflection, before sleep, review the day asking, where did I see evidence of God's fullness today? Train yourself to recognize His hand. Scripture saturation. Keep returning to Romans 8:28-39 until these truths become your default programming rather than inspiring exceptions. The reality shift happens not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small recalibrations, repeatedly bringing your perspective back into alignment with the truth. God is for you, and that changes everything about how you face whatever comes. Historical witnesses, this reality in action, this isn't theoretical. Throughout history, people have lived from this reality and demonstrated what it looks like in practice. Their stories aren't just inspiring, they're evidence that this paradigm actually works in the real world. Biblical examples: David facing Goliath is the classic picture. A teenager with a sling facing a warrior giant while an entire army watches. But notice David's calculation: "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty." David wasn't pretending the giant wasn't real or dangerous. He was operating from a different equation: Goliath plus his weapons versus God's purposes. The outcome was never in doubt once you factored God in. Esther faced potential genocide of her people and had to approach a king who could execute her on a whim. But Mordecai's challenge rang with this truth: "Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Esther's response, "If I perish, I perish," wasn't fatalism. It was confidence that even death couldn't derail God's purposes. And because she operated from that foundation, she approached the king with boldness that saved a nation. Daniel in the lion's den demonstrates this reality so vividly it's almost comical. His opponents crafted a law specifically to trap him. The king himself couldn't save him, and he spent the night surrounded by predators. But God sent an angel to shut the lions' mouths. When you're aligned with divine purposes, even the natural order bends to preserve you until your work is done. And when Daniel emerged unharmed, it wasn't just him who was vindicated, it was the God who was for him. Church history: the early martyrs faced systematic persecution from the most powerful empire on earth. By every earthly measure, they should have been obliterated. Instead, their blood became seed, and their confidence in the face of death convinced thousands that they possessed something worth dying for. Tertullian observed that the blood of martyrs is the seed of the Church. Rome tried to destroy Christianity through opposition and only managed to spread it. How did they face lions in the arena, burning at the stake, crucifixion? They believed God was so utterly for them that even death was just a doorway to his presence. Their bodies could be destroyed, but their ultimate reality, union with Christ, couldn't be touched. Martin Luther, standing before the Diet of Worms, facing potential execution for refusing to recant his teachings, declared, "Here I stand. I can do no other." He believed God's truth was more determinative than the emperor's power. He was excommunicated, declared an outlaw, hunted. And yet the Reformation spread, reshaping the entire trajectory of Christianity and Western civilization. Was this because God miraculously protected Luther from all harm? No, he spent the rest of his life in various forms of danger and conflict. But God was for him, in the sense that mattered most. Luther's work accomplished exactly what God intended, and ultimately nothing could prevent that. Contemporary witnesses Dietrich Bonhoeffer chose to return to Nazi Germany when he could have remained safe in America, believing God called him to resist evil. He was eventually executed just days before the camp was liberated. By earthly measures, a tragic waste. But his writings continued to influence millions, and his witness demonstrated that God being for us doesn't always mean physical deliverance. Sometimes it means being positioned to accomplish something eternal, even through death. Richard Wurmbrand spent 14 years in Romanian communist prisons, including 3 years in solitary confinement, tortured for his faith. He wrote about experiencing the presence of Christ so tangibly in that cell that he sometimes had to pray for God to ease the joy, because it was overwhelming. When opposition tried to destroy him, it instead positioned him for an encounter with divine presence so profound he wouldn't have traded it for anything. Countless unnamed believers have faced terminal diagnoses, financial ruin, systemic injustice, devastating losses, and testified that God met them in those places so powerfully that they experienced the truth of his forness more deeply than in comfortable seasons. Not that the suffering wasn't real, but that it couldn't separate them from the love and purposes of God. The pattern, what's the pattern across all these witnesses? It's not that God being for them meant life got easy. It's that God being for them meant they could face anything without being ultimately defeated. Opposition became opportunity. Suffering became platform. Death itself became doorway. They lived from a different reality, and it showed. They prove this isn't just beautiful theology, it's a paradigm that actually functions in the real world, across cultures, throughout history, in every imaginable circumstance. When people genuinely grasp and live from the truth that God is for them, they become remarkably difficult to destroy because you'd have to defeat God himself to ultimately harm them, and that's simply not possible. The paradox is, when God's for looks like against, we need to address the elephant in the room. If God is so absolutely for us, why do bad things still happen? Why do believers face suffering, loss, injustice, and sometimes even death? Why do prayers go unanswered? How do we reconcile God's advocacy with life's very real pain? This is where shallow theology crumbles and deep faith is forged. God being for us doesn't mean what we often want it to mean, that life will be comfortable, that we'll always get what we ask for, that we'll be shielded from pain. The paradox is that sometimes God's forness looks exactly like opposition in the moment. Consider Jesus in Gethsemane, sweating drops of blood, begging for the cup to pass from him. Was God for Jesus in that moment? Absolutely, so much so that he was about to accomplish the most important act in human history through his Son. But from Jesus' human experience it felt like abandonment. My God, why have you forsaken me? If Jesus experienced this paradox, we shouldn't be surprised when we do too. The key distinction is between God's immediate accommodation to our desires versus his ultimate commitment to our good. Hes promised the latter, not the former. And here's the uncomfortable truth: he knows what our good is better than we do. He sees the end from the beginning. He knows how suffering can forge character that comfort never could. He knows how weakness positions us for grace that strength would refuse. He knows how loss can create capacity for gain we'd never otherwise experience. This is the difference between a parent who gives a child everything they want versus a parent who gives them everything they need, even when what they need feels terrible in the moment. Chemotherapy is a kind of violence to the body, but when it's destroying cancer, it's an act of love. Surgery requires cutting and trauma, but it's healing. Some of God's best work in our lives feels, in the moment, like the opposite of advocacy. Paul himself is the ultimate example. God was so thoroughly for Paul that he called him to apostleship, gave him visions, used him to write much of the New Testament, and worked countless miracles through him. And in the same life, Paul experienced shipwreck, stoning, beatings, imprisonment, abandonment, chronic illness, and eventually execution. How do we reconcile these? Paul does it for us in 2 Corinthians. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. God being for him didn't prevent the hard-pressing, persecution, or being struck down. It meant those things couldn't accomplish their intended purpose of ultimate destruction. The opposition was real, the outcome was secured. This requires us to expand our timeline. We naturally evaluate God's forness based on immediate circumstances. Does this month, this year, this season feel like God is on my side? But God's purposes often work on timelines we can't perceive. Joseph spent years in slavery and prison, God being for him the entire time, before the purpose became clear. Abraham waited decades for the promised son. The Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. God's forness was operating constantly, but it didn't eliminate the waiting, the confusion, or the difficulty. There's also the reality that we live in a fallen world with natural consequences. God being for you doesn't override physics, biology, or the choices of other free agents. When drunk drivers kill innocent people, when diseases spread, when natural disasters strike, when humans exercise their evil freedom, these are consequences of living in a broken world, not evidence of God's abandonment. But even in these, God's commitment remains. He will work it for ultimate good, He will sustain you through it, and He will not waste a single drop of suffering if you'll let Him use it. The mystery we must hold is this: we can't always see how God is working for our good in real time, but that doesn't change the reality that He is. Sometimes the only way to maintain this faith is to remember the cross itself. When Jesus hung dying, it looked like utter defeat. The disciples experienced it as the end of everything they'd hoped for. But God was most profoundly for humanity in that exact moment, accomplishing what could be accomplished no other way. If we can trust God's forness at the cross when it looked most like abandonment, we can trust it in our circumstances too. We don't have to understand the how or why in the moment. We anchor in the character of God, proven at the cross, and the promise that He's working all things for good. This doesn't make the pain less real or the grief less valid. Lament is all through Scripture, people crying out to God, how long and why? But notice, they're crying to God, not about God. They believe He's there, He's listening, and He can be trusted even when nothing makes sense. The reality shift isn't from pain to comfort. It's from interpreting our circumstances as evidence of God's position toward us, to seeing God's proven position as the lens through which we interpret our circumstances. The latter allows us to endure mysteries we can't resolve because we're anchored to what we know. God is for us, proven at the cross, unchanging in character, and utterly trustworthy with outcomes we can't yet see. Making the shift, Wave journeyed from a parking lot moment of fear to the theological depths of God's advocacy, through the mathematics of divine alliance, across the landscape of psychological transformation, into practical modern applications, through historical witnesses, and finally into the paradoxes we can't fully resolve. The question remains, so what now? The reality shift from seeing if God is for us as an inspiring verse to experiencing it as actual reality doesn't happen through a single decision. It happens through 10,000 small recalibrations. It happens through repeatedly bringing your default assumptions back into alignment with this truth until it becomes your actual operating system rather than an encouraging add-on. Here's what this requires. You have to stop measuring God's fullness by your immediate circumstances and start measuring your circumstances by God's proven fullness. That's the shift. Every anxiety, every opposition, every disappointment becomes an opportunity to ask, not where is God, but how is God working for me even in this? Have you ever wondered why, despite years of spiritual seeking, prayer and religious devotion, God still feels distant and unreachable? What if everything you've been taught about finding the divine has been leading you in the wrong direction all along? For centuries, humanity has been on a relentless quest for divine connection. We've built magnificent cathedrals and temples, we've studied ancient texts until the pages wore thin, we've followed spiritual teachers across continents, all searching for that elusive presence we call God. Has this ever happened to you? That moment when, despite all your devotion, you still feel something essential is missing? But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. What Joel Goldsmith discovered through his profound spiritual journey might completely transform how you understand your relationship with the divine. The revolutionary truth that changed his life, and could change yours, is both shockingly simple and deeply profound. The Christ consciousness you've been desperately seeking outside yourself has always been within you. not as some vague spiritual concept or comforting belief, but as the fundamental reality of your very being. This isn't about adopting a new belief system or adding another spiritual practice to your already busy life. It's about recognizing what has always been true about you before any thought, emotion, or experience ever arose in your awareness. The divine presence isn't something you need to attain through years of disciplined practice or earn through righteous behavior. It's your original nature, your true spiritual identity that exists beyond all temporary human experiences that seem to define who you are. Stay with me until the end of this series, because what you're about to discover might surprise you in ways that could completely transform your experience of life itself. When you truly understand that Christ consciousness isn't a historical figure who lived 2,000 years ago or some distant deity sitting in judgment of your every action, but rather the very essence of your being, something miraculous happens. Imagine moving through your days from a place of inherent wholeness rather than constant seeking. Imagine relating to your challenges and difficulties from a consciousness of divine indifference, not callous disconnection, but unshakable inner peace that remains steady regardless of outer circumstances. What if the answer to the spiritual longing that's been driving your search has been present within you all along, quietly waiting for recognition beneath the noise of your thinking mind and the drama of your emotional life? What if the divine presence you've been seeking through books, teachers, and sacred places is actually the awareness that's reading these very words right now? The profound mystical realization that Joel Goldsmith experienced wasn't the result of intellectual study or religious doctrine. It came through direct experience, a moment of pure recognition that changed everything for him and could do the same for you. His revelation wasn't the product of years in theological seminaries or endless hours poring over ancient texts. It emerged from the depths of silent contemplation, from moments of complete surrender to that which exists beyond the thinking mind. If these teachings speak to your heart, hit subscribe to join our community of spiritual explorers on this journey of discovering the Christ consciousness within. You see, Joel Goldsmith had tried the conventional path. He'd studied spiritual texts, followed religious practices, and sought guidance from various teachers. But something fundamental was missing in this approach, a direct, lived experience of the truth he was seeking. The journey toward this revelation wasn't about accumulating more knowledge, but about allowing a deeper recognition to dawn within his consciousness. The breakthrough came during those quiet moments of pure presence, when the noise of mental chatter subsided and something else, something infinitely more profound, emerged into awareness. In that space of inner stillness, Goldsmith experienced a fundamental shift in perception. He saw with absolute clarity that the Christ consciousness he had been seeking had never been separate from him, not even for a millisecond. This wasn't just another spiritual insight to add to his collection of beliefs. It was a complete revolution in how he experienced himself and the world around him. The mindset transformation was so profound that it rippled through every aspect of his existence. Perhaps, most remarkably, chronic physical conditions that had plagued him for years, conditions that hadn't responded to medical treatments, simply dissolved without intervention. This wasn't faith healing in the conventional sense. It was the natural result of recognizing his true identity beyond the limited concept of a physical body subject to illness and deterioration. But the revelations didn't stop there. Financial concerns that had created constant worry and limitation in his life began resolving themselves in ways he couldn't have orchestrated through strategic planning or willpower. Abundance started flowing naturally, not because he was manifesting it through techniques or affirmations, but because he was living from a different foundation altogether, one where lack had never been the truth of his being. The hidden truth behind these seemingly miraculous transformations wasn't that Goldsmith had finally found the right spiritual technique or practice. It was that he had recognized something fundamental about the nature of consciousness itself. The impact of this recognition was so complete that his entire journey through life took on a different quality, one marked by grace rather than struggle, by allowing rather than forcing, by recognition rather than achievement. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by exploring what this profound spiritual understanding actually means for our day-to-day experience. When we begin to recognize that Christ consciousness isn't something distant or separate from us, but the very essence of our being, we discover a freedom that changes everything about how we navigate life's challenges and opportunities. The decision to recognize your true nature isn't just another spiritual step on an endless path. It's a fundamental reset of your entire relationship with existence. It's about discovering the ground of being that has always been present beneath the surface turbulence of thoughts, emotions, and changing circumstances. If you're feeling a resonance with these words, write in the comments, "I recognize the truth within." When we speak of recognizing that Christ lives within us, we're talking about something far more profound than simply adopting a new spiritual concept or belief system. This isn't about intellectually agreeing with a doctrine or repeating affirmations until you convince yourself of something. It's about a direct recognition of what is already true about your nature right now, in this very moment. Consider this revelation. The pure awareness that is reading these words right now, the consciousness that observes your thoughts arising and passing, that notices sensations in your body and emotions flowing through your experience. This awareness itself is Christ consciousness expressing as your individual being. It's not something you need to create, develop, or attain through spiritual practice. It's what you already are beneath the constant stream of thoughts, emotions, and sensations that typically dominate your attention. This shift in perspective catalyzes a profound transformation in how you relate to the challenges and problems that inevitably arise in human experience. When you truly understand that Christ lives in you, you no longer approach difficulties from a place of lack, fear, or desperation. Your mindset undergoes a fundamental recalibration. Instead of seeing problems as obstacles to overcome or enemies to defeat, you begin to recognize them as opportunities to express your divine nature. The struggle against circumstances begins to dissolve as you realize that your essential being is already whole, perfect, and lacking absolutely nothing. This doesn't mean challenges magically disappear from your life. It means your relationship to them changes so completely that they no longer have the power to disturb your inner peace. Behind the scenes of this transformation is a revolutionary insight. The divine consciousness that constitutes your true identity isn't affected by any circumstance, condition, or temporary experience. Just as the sun continues shining regardless of passing clouds, your spiritual essence remains untouched by the changing weather patterns of human experience. This understanding creates a new foundation for navigating life's journey. Rather than constantly fighting against what is or desperately trying to change conditions through willpower and endless effort, you begin operating from a recognition of your inherent completeness. Decisions flow from a place of wisdom rather than fear. Actions emerge naturally, from clarity rather than from reaction to perceived threats or limitations. Subscribe now to deepen your understanding of these transformative spiritual principles that can completely reshape your experience of life's challenges. The impact of this shift extends far beyond just feeling better about your problems. It completely reconfigures how you move through the world. You begin experiencing what Goldsmith called divine indifference, which isn't callousness or lack of caring, but rather a profound stability that remains unshaken regardless of outer appearances. Let's explore this further by examining how this recognition illuminates our approach to the specific challenges that appear in our daily lives, whether they manifest as health concerns, relationship difficulties, or financial pressures. The pathway to freedom isn't about eliminating these situations, but recognizing the truth of who you are in relation to them. If you've experienced moments where you glimpse this deeper reality beyond your problems, write in the comments, "I've felt this peace within." When we begin living from this understanding, we naturally develop what Goldsmith called divine indifference. Now, this term might sound alarming at first, as if it suggests becoming cold or unfeeling toward the suffering in our world or in our own lives. But that's not at all what this concept describes. Divine indifference is actually a profound inner peace, a remarkable stability that remains unshaken, regardless of what's happening in the external world. Imagine standing in the eye of a hurricane. All around you, winds rage and destruction unfolds, yet where you stand, there is perfect stillness. This is the kind of centered presence that emerges when you recognize your true identity as spiritual being rather than as vulnerable human personality, subject to the countless forces that seem to control ordinary experience. This isn't spiritual bypassing or denial of human reality, it's anchoring your awareness in something more fundamental than the temporary weather patterns of circumstance. The insights behind this transformation have been whispered by mystics throughout the ages, yet they often get obscured by complex theological systems or diluted into intellectual concepts that miss the essential revelation. Here's where Goldsmith's teaching becomes truly revolutionary. He understood that the journey to spiritual awakening isn't about becoming something you're not currently. It's not about achieving enlightenment through decades of arduous practice or earning divine connection through virtuous behavior. The breakthrough realization is that you don't need to become spiritual. You already are a spiritual being in your essential nature. This mindset shift changes everything. Instead of approaching spirituality as a journey of achievement where you gradually accumulate enough merit, practice, or wisdom to finally reach a distant goal, you recognize what has always been true about you in this very moment. The Christ consciousness isn't something you must develop or attain. It's what you are beneath the layers of conditioned thinking and temporary human experience. This revelation often triggers a profound sense of relief. All those years of spiritual striving, of feeling like you're never quite there yet, suddenly reveal themselves as unnecessary. The paradigm completely shifts from becoming to being, from achieving to recognizing, from future attainment to present reality. Consider how this might transform your approach to meditation, prayer, or spiritual practice. Instead of using these as techniques to eventually reach enlightenment or divine connection, they become opportunities to clear away the temporary clouds of thought and emotion that obscure your recognition of what already is. They're not ladders to climb, but windows to open, allowing the light that's always been present to shine through more clearly. This approach completely reframes the spiritual journey. Rather than seeing yourself as a separate being trying to connect with a distant divine source, you recognize that the divine source is what you already are in your deepest essence. This isn't spiritual theory. It's the practical foundation for a completely different way of moving through life's challenges and opportunities. Let's explore how this recognition manifests in everyday experience, particularly when we face situations that would normally trigger stress, anxiety, or a sense of being overwhelmed. The practical application of this truth is where its power becomes most evident. If you've ever felt that spiritual growth was too complicated or out of reach, type in the comments, "I am already complete." What happens when this recognition of Christ consciousness becomes more than an occasional insight but your lived reality? Something truly remarkable begins to unfold in your relationships with others. Without any conscious effort to heal or help anyone, people around you start experiencing transformation simply by being in your presence. It's as if your clear recognition creates a field of energy, an atmosphere where others can more easily glimpse their own divine nature. This phenomenon isn't about developing special healing powers or becoming some kind of spiritual guru that others should follow. It's much more organic and natural than that. When you consistently live from the recognition of your true identity, you naturally stop reinforcing others' limited self-concepts and begin reflecting back to them their own innate wholeness. This silent acknowledgement often does more to facilitate healing than hours of well-intentioned advice or therapeutic intervention. This was precisely how Joel Goldsmith was able to facilitate remarkable healings for thousands of people throughout his ministry, without ever claiming to heal anyone or taking credit for the transformations that occurred. He simply maintained consistent recognition of spiritual truth, both about himself and those who came to him, creating a space where people could experience their own divine nature and the natural healing that flows from that recognition. The journey of Sarah illustrates this principle perfectly. After suffering from debilitating anxiety disorder for 15 long years, she had become desperate for relief. She had tried everything: multiple medications, cognitive behavioral therapy, breathing techniques, meditation apps, energy healing, and countless other approaches. Thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours later, she still lived in constant fear, with her nervous system perpetually in fight-or-flight mode. When Sarah first encountered these teachings about Christ consciousness being her true identity, she initially dismissed them as impractical religious platitudes. How could abstract spiritual concepts possibly help with the very real, intense physical symptoms that often left her unable to function normally? But something deep within her recognized a ring of truth in these words that went beyond her intellectual skepticism. Rather than adding another technique to her arsenal of anxiety management strategies, Sarah began practicing something radically different. During moments when anxiety was particularly overwhelming, instead of fighting against the sensations or trying to make them go away through various coping mechanisms, she would silently acknowledge the divine presence within her. This anxiety is something I'm experiencing, but it is not what I am. This simple recognition created space between her true self and the temporary emotional weather passing through her experience. She wasn't denying the anxiety or pretending it wasn't happening. She was simply recognizing that these sensations and thoughts, however intense, weren't her fundamental identity. The blueprint for transformation had been activated. Within just a few weeks, something profound began shifting. The anxiety didn't magically disappear overnight, but her relationship to it changed so completely that the same feelings no longer had the power to control her life. She began experiencing a deep, unshakable peace underlying all surface emotions, like discovering still waters beneath turbulent waves. Let's explore how this same principle applies to other areas of human experience, where suffering seems inevitable, and how this recognition creates pathways to freedom that conventional approaches often miss entirely. If you've struggled with anxiety or emotional patterns that seem impossible to break, write in the comments, "I am not my emotions." Michael's story reveals another dimension of this profound truth. When facing severe financial crisis that threatened to destroy everything he had worked for throughout his adult life, he found himself at a breaking point. His business had failed, debts were mounting to overwhelming proportions, and he felt completely desperate, even abandoned by God. He began questioning everything he had believed about spiritual principles. When a close friend introduced Michael to Goldsmith's teachings about divine sonship and infinite supply, his initial reaction was skepticism. How could abstract spiritual concepts possibly solve very concrete problems like mortgage payments and business obligations? Like many of us, he wanted to use spiritual truth as a technique to fix his dire financial situation, essentially treating divine principles as a sophisticated manifestation. Method. The watershed moment came when Michael completely abandoned this approach. Instead of trying to use spiritual practices to attract money or manipulate circumstances, he began living from the recognition of his spiritual identity as the consciousness in which infinite supply already exists as present reality. Each morning, he would acknowledge the unlimited abundance within his own consciousness, not as a method for attracting prosperity, but as simple recognition of what was already true about his spiritual nature, regardless of bank account balances. This strategic mindset shift created space for something remarkable to unfold. New opportunities began appearing in the most unexpected ways and through the most unlikely channels. Former clients he hadn't heard from in years suddenly contacted him with profitable projects. Investment opportunities surfaced through casual conversations that led to significant returns he never could have planned or orchestrated. Yet, the true miracle wasn't the improved financial circumstances. The real transformation was Michael's entire relationship to security and abundance. He no longer lived in constant fear and worry about money because he finally understood that his true source wasn't external circumstances, but the infinite consciousness within him. The journey revealed that he had never actually been separate from his source of supply, the infinite creative intelligence that expresses as individual consciousness and naturally attracts everything needed for abundant living. Margaret's healing journey illuminates this same principle from an entirely different angle. After receiving a devastating diagnosis of advanced cancer that had spread throughout her body and wasn't responding to conventional treatments, doctors gave her only 6 months to live. She had exhausted all medical options. Traditional chemotherapy and radiation had failed to slow the progression of her condition. Feeling hopeless, angry, and terrified about leaving her young children without a mother, Margaret initially rejected spiritual approaches completely. When someone suggested that Christ consciousness was her true identity, she felt furious that anyone would offer what seemed like empty spiritual platitudes during such a profound medical crisis. Yet in her darkest moment of despair, something deep within her consciousness was willing to consider an alternative perspective, that there might be a truth about her identity that existed beyond medical diagnosis and statistical prognoses. She began spending time each day, not desperately praying for healing or bargaining with God, but simply resting in the quiet recognition of her spiritual wholeness that existed prior to any physical condition or medical label. This revelation began shifting Margaret's consciousness in subtle yet profound ways. Instead of identifying herself primarily as a person with cancer who might die, she started recognizing herself as eternal spiritual consciousness temporarily experiencing physical challenges. This wasn't denial of her medical condition or refusal of appropriate treatment. It was recognition of a deeper identity that remained whole, regardless of what appeared to be happening in her physical form. If you've ever faced a seemingly impossible health challenge or financial situation, share in the comments. I am more than my circumstances. These powerful stories of transformation aren't isolated incidents or rare spiritual achievements reserved for specially gifted individuals. They reflect what becomes possible when we integrate this recognition into our daily lives through simple yet profound practices. One of the most essential techniques Joel Goldsmith taught was maintaining what he called the listening attitude throughout your day. This listening attitude isn't about straining to hear an external God speaking to you in words or waiting for dramatic mystical experiences. It's about cultivating a gentle, ongoing awareness of the divine presence within your own consciousness during all daily activities. Whether you're in a business meeting, preparing dinner, having a conversation, or driving in traffic, you can maintain this subtle recognition of the Christ consciousness that constitutes your true identity. The practice is beautifully simple. Throughout your day, take brief moments to simply pause and silently acknowledge, the Christ that I am is present right now. You don't need to feel anything special or achieve any particular spiritual state. Simply recognize this truth about your identity in the present moment. This isn't about adding another task to your already busy schedule. It's about bringing a different quality of awareness to everything you're already doing. This practice gradually shifts your center of identity from personality, circumstances, emotions and thoughts to the changeless divine consciousness within you. Decisions begin flowing from inner wisdom rather than fear or conditioned patterns. Your actions become expressions of your spiritual nature rather than reactions to external triggers. This is what Goldsmith called living by grace, allowing divine intelligence to guide your journey naturally, without the constant struggle of human will and effort. This inner recognition naturally extends to how you perceive others as well. When you encounter someone experiencing challenges, difficulties, illness, or any form of limitation, instead of sympathizing with their problems or getting caught up in their narrative of suffering, you can silently recognize their spiritual identity. You see them as divine consciousness, appearing in human form rather than identifying them with their temporary circumstances or personality patterns. This silent acknowledgement isn't about ignoring practical needs or being coldly detached. It's about recognizing something fundamental about others that they may have temporarily forgotten about themselves. The illumination that comes from this recognition creates an atmosphere where healing and transformation can occur naturally through their own awakening to their true nature. The ripple effects of this practice are often astonishing. People begin sensing something different in your presence, a quality of acceptance and recognition that allows their own divine nature to surface more easily. Many report feeling mysteriously peaceful, inspired, or suddenly clear about solutions to problems after being with someone who practices this recognition consistently. The subtle power of this approach lies in its simplicity. You're not trying to change anyone, fix their problems, or convince them of spiritual truth. You're simply maintaining awareness of what they truly are, regardless of appearances, which creates a field where their own healing intelligence can activate naturally. Let's examine how this practice transforms our most challenging relationships and situations in ways that conventional approaches often miss entirely. If you've experienced how your perception of others affects their behavior and well-being, write in the comments, "I hold the vision of wholeness." Another powerful dimension of this practice reveals itself when we face challenging emotions that typically overwhelm or destabilize us. Joel taught a remarkably effective approach for handling difficult emotions through spiritual recognition rather than through suppression, analysis, or resistance, methods that often intensify our suffering rather than alleviating it. When anger, fear, sadness, or any intense emotion arises in your experience, instead of fighting against it or getting caught in analyzing why it's happening, simply recognize your true identity in relation to it. Acknowledge silently, "I am experiencing anger right now, but anger is not what I am. I am the divine consciousness observing this temporary emotional weather pattern." This insight creates a healthy space between your essential nature and passing emotional experiences. You're not denying or suppressing the emotion, quite the opposite. You're allowing it to be fully present in your awareness, while simultaneously recognizing that your fundamental identity remains untouched by any temporary feeling state. This perspective shift enables emotions to move through your experience naturally without becoming stuck or defining your self-concept. The freedom this practice brings is revolutionary. Most of us spend enormous energy either fighting against uncomfortable emotions or becoming completely identified with them, both approaches that keep us trapped in cycles of reactivity and suffering. This recognition offers a third path that neither suppresses nor indulges emotional patterns, but allows them to be present within the spaciousness of your true nature. When we extend this understanding to all areas of life, a comprehensive transformation begins unfolding naturally. Consider how your approach to work shifts when you live consistently from the awareness that Christ lives in you as your actual identity. Your career becomes an expression of your divine nature rather than a struggle for survival, security, or personal achievement. Business decisions begin flowing from inner wisdom and genuine service rather than from the fear, competition, or ego ambition that characterizes most commercial activity. You find yourself naturally attracted to opportunities and relationships that align with your spiritual values and support your highest expression, while situations that compromise your integrity or drain your energy naturally fall away without dramatic confrontations or forced exits. Your presence in meetings, collaborative projects, and all professional interactions takes on a quality that others notice and appreciate, even if they can't quite articulate what feels different about working with you. Similarly, all relationships undergo profound transformation when you consistently recognize the divine nature in yourself and others. Instead of relating to people based on their personality patterns, past behavior, or current circumstances, you maintain awareness of their spiritual identity beneath temporary expressions. This doesn't mean ignoring practical considerations or avoiding appropriate boundaries. Rather, you combine spiritual recognition with human wisdom, creating space for others to express their highest qualities naturally. When you stop reacting to people's limited expressions and consistently see their divine nature, they often begin responding from that higher level of their being. The blueprint of this approach creates pathways for resolving conflicts and healing relationships that conventional approaches often miss entirely. If you've noticed how your inner state affects your external environment and relationships, type in the comments, "As within, so without." As we come to this moment of reflection in our exploration of Joel Goldsmith's profound teaching that Christ lives within you, I hope you've glimpsed something beyond intellectual understanding, perhaps a recognition of your own divine nature that was always present beneath the surface of your human experience. This recognition isn't something you achieve through effort, but something you allow yourself to remember in moments of presence. The journey of integrating this understanding into daily life is both beautifully simple and endlessly deep. If something in this message resonated with your own inner knowing, I'd love to continue this conversation with you in the comments. Simply write, "I recognize the Christ within," to let me know these teachings found their home in you. If you found value in this perspective, consider subscribing to join our community of spiritual explorers. Each week, we dive into these transformative principles that have the power to completely reconfigure your relationship with life's challenges and opportunities. Your subscription helps us continue creating content that points toward the deepest truths of our being. Leaving a like on this video helps others discover these teachings at exactly the moment they may need them most. A synchronicity that often brings these principles to people precisely when they're ready to receive them. I've created a video that explores how to apply these principles specifically to healing relationships that seem beyond repair. It's a perfect complement to what we've discussed today, revealing how the recognition of divine consciousness transforms even our most challenging connections. Click right here to continue this journey of discovery with me. The divine presence that you are is already complete, I'm simply honored to remind you of what you've always known.
There is a teaching so transformative that when you truly grasp it, your entire relationship with God, yourself, and life itself changes forever. Joel Goldsmith spent decades revealing this secret. You are not a sinner seeking redemption. You are already God's child, complete and whole. The moment you stop identifying as broken, everything shifts. Most spiritual seekers spend their entire lives begging for forgiveness, trying to earn God's love, believing they must prove their worthiness. This is the greatest illusion ever sold to humanity. It keeps you small, afraid, and separated from your divine nature. Joel discovered that this belief system is the root of all suffering and disease. When you recognize yourself as God's offspring, not as a fallen creature, you stop asking God for things. You stop bargaining, pleading, and hoping. Instead, you begin recognizing what already is. This is not positive thinking or affirmation. This is spiritual fact. You are the expression of infinite consciousness right now, not someday when you become good enough. The traditional religious model teaches you to confess sins, ask forgiveness, and hope God grants your prayers. Joel Goldsmith turned this completely upside down. He said that prayer is not about changing God's mind about you. Prayer is about changing your mind about yourself. God already knows you as perfect spiritual being. Think about this revolutionary idea. If God is infinite and all, then God cannot create anything unlike itself. A perfect cause cannot produce an imperfect effect. The sun cannot create darkness. Infinite love cannot create a sinner. Your true identity was established before time began, and nothing you've done or will do can alter it. This doesn't mean you ignore mistakes or harmful actions. It means you stop building your identity around them. You stop living from the consciousness of guilt and unworthiness. When you know yourself as God's child, your behavior naturally aligns with love, not because you're trying to earn something, but because you're expressing what you already are. Joel Goldsmith taught that the moment you accept your true identity as God's spiritual offspring, healing begins automatically. Why? Because most disease, lack, and struggle come from the belief in separation. When you believe you're cut off from God, cut off from good, your consciousness creates experiences that match that belief. But here's what happens when you shift. Imagine waking up tomorrow knowing with absolute certainty that you are the beloved child of infinite intelligence. Not hoping for it, not working toward it, but knowing it as present fact. How would you walk through your day? What fears would dissolve? What new possibilities would open? This knowing is not arrogance or ego. It's the humility of recognizing that your good doesn't come from your human efforts. It flows from your spiritual identity. You don't create abundance, health, or love. You recognize them as already present in consciousness. This is the secret Joel spent his life teaching, and it changes everything within weeks when practiced daily. Here's the practical application Joel gave his students. Stop all prayers that begin with asking God for something. Instead, begin every spiritual practice with recognition. Recognize that God is infinite presence right where you are. Recognize that this presence is your true identity. Recognize that nothing can be added to what is already complete. This feels strange at first because we're trained to see ourselves as beggars at the throne of God. But Joel discovered through decades of healing work that the most powerful prayer is simply resting in the awareness of what already is. Not trying to get God's attention, but recognizing God as the only presence and power. When you live from this consciousness, even for a few minutes each day, your entire experience begins to transform. Problems that seemed impossible start resolving. Relationships heal. Resources appear. Not because you manipulated God, but because you stopped blocking the natural flow of good with the belief in your own unworthiness and separation. Let me share a transformation story that reveals the power of this teaching. A woman came to Joel Goldsmith consumed with guilt over her past. She had made choices that hurt her family, and for 15 years she carried this burden. Every prayer was an apology, every meditation a confession. She believed God was punishing her with illness and financial struggle. Joel asked her one simple question. Can God's child ever stop being God's child? She was silent. He continued, if you are the offspring of infinite love, when did that stop being true? Show me the moment you ceased being spiritual. She couldn't. The guilt was real. The pain was real. But her identity as God's child had never changed. Within 3 months of releasing the sinner identity and recognizing herself as God's beloved child, her chronic pain diminished significantly. Within 6 months, an unexpected opportunity restored her financial stability. But the greatest healing was internal. She stopped living in the past and began experiencing the presence of God in the present moment. This wasn't magic or wishful thinking. When consciousness shifts from unworthiness to spiritual identity, the entire energy field transforms. What was blocked begins to flow. This is the practical mysticism Joel taught, and thousands experienced similar transformations over decades. Another powerful example involves a man who spent 20 years in traditional religion, always feeling he fell short of God's standards. He prayed constantly for forgiveness, tried to be good enough, but always felt distant from God. His health reflected this consciousness: anxiety, insomnia, high blood pressure, constant stress. When he discovered Joel's teachings, everything shifted. Instead of morning prayers asking God to forgive him and help him be better, he began with recognition. I am God's spiritual offspring right now. Nothing I did yesterday changed this truth. Nothing I will do today can alter it. I rest in this completed identity. The first week felt mechanical, like he was lying to himself. But Joel taught that you're not creating truth, you're recognizing it. By the 3rd week, something broke open in his consciousness. He felt a peace he'd never known. The constant mental chatter of self-judgment quieted. He started sleeping through the night. Within 4 months, his blood pressure normalized without medication changes. His relationships improved because he stopped projecting his own self-judgment onto others. He found himself naturally making healthier choices, not from guilt or fear, but from the consciousness of wholeness. This is what happens when you stop being a sinner and become who you already are. Joel Goldsmith discovered something profound in his healing practice. People who carried the heaviest religious guilt often had the most physical ailments. The connection wasn't coincidental. When you believe you're fundamentally flawed, separated from God, and deserving punishment, your body responds to that consciousness. Disease is often the physical manifestation of spiritual misidentification. But here's the transformation. A woman with severe arthritis had spent decades believing her pain was punishment for past mistakes. When she began recognizing herself as God's spiritual child, complete and whole, something remarkable happened. She stopped mentally rehearsing her failures. She stopped reliving moments of shame and regret. As her thought patterns changed, her inflammation gradually reduced over several months. Her doctors were surprised but had no explanation. Joel knew. Consciousness creates experience. When you live from the awareness of spiritual wholeness rather than human brokenness, the body begins reflecting that higher truth. This isn't denying the physical, it's recognizing the spiritual as primary. The healing wasn't instant, and it required daily practice. But within 8 months, she experienced 70% improvement. More importantly, she was free from the mental prison of guilt that had tormented her for 30 years. She had stopped being a sinner in her own mind and accepted her true identity. Here's what Joel emphasized repeatedly. This teaching isn't about becoming God's child someday through enough good behavior or spiritual practice. You cannot become what you already are. The entire journey is about recognition, not achievement. Every moment you spend trying to earn God's love, you're denying the love that's already present. This is why traditional approaches often fail to bring lasting peace. They keep you focused on your inadequacy rather than your divine nature. They make God into a distant authority figure you must please rather than the infinite consciousness that is your true identity. Joel's mystical Christianity reveals what Jesus actually taught. The kingdom of God is within you now. When you grasp this truth, not intellectually but in the depths of your being, transformation is inevitable. You stop living from lack and limitation. You stop seeing yourself through the lens of past mistakes. You begin experiencing the presence of God not as something you seek, but as what you are. This is the secret that changes everything. If these transformation stories inspire you, like this video to help others discover their true identity as God's child. Subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom that breaks religious conditioning, and comment. Which story of recognition and healing touched your heart most deeply today? Beyond the foundational recognition of your spiritual identity, Joel taught specific practices to deepen this consciousness. The first is what he called the practice of the presence. This isn't complicated meditation or ritual. It's simply pausing throughout your day to recognize that God is the only presence where you are, and you are the expression of that presence. Start with this. Before responding to any situation today, take 3 seconds to silently acknowledge, God is present here as me. Not God is with me, helping me, or supporting me, but God is being me. This subtle shift in language reflects the truth that you're not separate from divine consciousness seeking connection. You are the activity of God in expression. When a challenge appears, instead of immediately trying to fix it from human effort, pause and recognize spiritual identity first. I am God's offspring. This situation cannot change that truth. What would divine consciousness reveal here? This isn't passive waiting, it's active recognition that shifts your entire approach from struggle to flow. Joel's students who practiced this consistently reported that solutions appeared more naturally, relationships improved without forced effort, and a sense of rightness pervaded their days. One businessman said he stopped approaching deals from anxiety about winning and instead from recognition of spiritual completeness, and his success rate doubled within a year. The second practice Joel emphasized is releasing personal sense. This means recognizing that the you who feels inadequate, guilty, or separate doesn't actually exist. It's a false identity constructed from years of conditioning, judgment, and misunderstanding. When you stop defending and maintaining this false self, your true spiritual identity emerges naturally. Here's how this works practically. When self-criticism arises, instead of fighting it or believing it, simply observe it and say internally, "This is not my voice. This is old programming. My true identity is established by God, not by my past or my thoughts." This is an affirmation to convince yourself. It's recognition of what's actually true beneath the mental noise. A teacher who practiced this for 3 months noticed her constant anxiety about performance disappeared. She stopped taking students' behavior personally. She found herself responding from wisdom rather than reacting from fear. Her energy levels increased because she wasn't burning fuel maintaining a false identity that required constant defense and validation. The practice feels uncomfortable initially because ego fights for survival. But Joel taught that ego is just mistaken identity, not an enemy to battle. As you consistently recognize your spiritual nature, the false sense naturally dissolves like darkness when light appears. You don't fight darkness, you turn on the light of truth. The third transformative practice is living from the consciousness of already being what you seek. Most people pray for health while identifying as sick, pray for abundance while identifying as lacking, pray for love while believing they're unworthy. This divided consciousness blocks demonstration. Joel taught that you must live from the end, from spiritual completeness. This means if you're seeking healing, you stop identifying as a sick person, hoping to become well. Instead, you recognize yourself as spiritual being, already whole in God's consciousness. The body may still show symptoms temporarily, but your identity shifts from sick person to complete spiritual expression. This shift in consciousness is what allows healing to manifest physically over time. A man with chronic fatigue practiced this. Instead of constantly monitoring his energy levels and identifying as tired, he began each day recognizing himself as spiritual being, tireless and complete. He stopped talking about his exhaustion, stopped researching his symptoms obsessively, and started living from wholeness. Within 2 months, his energy gradually returned. This isn't denial of physical experience. It's recognition that spiritual identity is more fundamental than physical appearance. As consciousness changes, experience follows. Joel proved this truth through decades of healing work. The key is patience and consistency, knowing that demonstration follows realization, sometimes immediately, sometimes gradually, over weeks or months. The fourth practice Joel gave is meditation without words. Most spiritual practice involves mental activity, repeating mantras, visualizing outcomes, or thinking spiritual thoughts. Joel taught that the highest consciousness is silent awareness, resting in the presence of God without trying to direct it or use it for personal purposes. This is pure recognition without agenda. Here's the practice. Sit quietly and release all attempts to make something happen. Don't try to feel peaceful. Don't try to contact God. Don't try to solve problems. Simply rest in awareness itself, recognizing that God is present as the very consciousness with which you're aware. This isn't passive. It's the most active state possible because you're letting infinite intelligence operate without human interference. A woman practiced this for just 10 minutes daily. She stopped her usual prayers, asking God for help with her struggling business. She simply sat in silent recognition of divine presence. Within 3 weeks, ideas began flowing naturally. Within 2 months, her business turned around completely. Not from her strategic planning, but from inspiration that arose from consciousness. Joel discovered that this wordless awareness is where true transformation happens. When you stop trying to use God and simply rest in being God's expression, divine intelligence operates through you naturally. Solutions appear, resources manifest, relationships heal, and your entire life reorganizes around spiritual truth rather than human struggle and effort. Now let's address the challenges you'll face when adopting this consciousness. The first and most persistent obstacle is guilt about past actions. You'll recognize yourself as God's child, feel peace for a moment, then memory brings up something you did years ago and the old identity returns. How can I be God's perfect child when I did that terrible thing? Joel anticipated this challenge. He taught that mistakes are part of the human experience, but they don't define your spiritual identity. A child learning to walk falls repeatedly, but falling doesn't make them less the parent's child. Your spiritual identity was established by God, not by your behavior. Nothing you've done can change what God created you to be. The practical solution is this. When guilt arises, don't fight it or suppress it. Acknowledge the feeling, then gently return to recognition. Yes, I made that choice. Yes, it caused harm. And yes, I remain God's spiritual offspring. These two truths coexist. The guilt will arise less frequently as you consistently choose recognition over identification with past actions. One student struggled with this for months. Every time he felt close to God, memories of his addiction years would flood back. Joel told him, "The memory is just memory. It has no power to change your spiritual identity. Let it arise, observe it without judgment, and return to truth." Within 6 months of this practice, the memories lost their emotional charge completely. The second major challenge is the physical evidence that seems to contradict spiritual identity. Your bank account shows lack, your body shows disease, your relationships show conflict. How can you recognize yourself as God's complete child when physical evidence screams otherwise? This is where most people abandon the teaching and return to traditional begging prayers. Joel's answer was profound. Physical appearance is the effect, not the cause. Consciousness is cause. When you change consciousness first and maintain that change consistently despite appearances, the physical gradually conforms. But if you let appearance dictate consciousness, nothing changes. This requires what Joel called spiritual maturity, the willingness to stand in truth despite contrary evidence. A couple facing bankruptcy practiced this principle. Instead of constant panic about bills, they spent 30 minutes each morning recognizing their spiritual identity as expressions of infinite supply. They took practical action during the day, but from consciousness of completeness rather than desperation. It felt like lying to themselves initially, but after 6 weeks, unexpected opportunities emerged. After 3 months, their financial situation had completely turned around. They later realized the shift happened internally first. They stopped emanating desperation, which changed how people responded to them. They made clearer decisions from peace rather than panic. Consciousness creates experience, but you must maintain new consciousness long enough for it to demonstrate physically. The third challenge is the resistance from religious programming. If you were raised believing you're a sinner who needs constant forgiveness, recognizing yourself as God's already perfect child feels like arrogance or heresy. Old voices echo in your mind. Who do you think you are? You're just a human. This is pride. You need to humble yourself before God. Joel addressed this directly. True humility is recognizing that your goodness comes from God, not from you. False humility is denying that you express God's nature. When you say, "I am God's spiritual child, complete and whole," you're not claiming personal achievement. You're acknowledging what God created, which actually glorifies God more than calling yourself a miserable sinner. A woman from strict religious background wrestled with this intensely. Every time she recognized her spiritual identity, she felt she was dishonoring God. Joel explained, does a parent want their child to constantly call themselves worthless? Or does the parent delight when the child recognizes the love and gifts they've been given? This reframe changed everything for her. She began seeing that her old religious training actually kept her focused on herself and her inadequacy rather than on God's nature. True God focus meant recognizing God's perfect expression, which is what she actually was. Within months, she experienced more genuine connection with divine presence than decades of traditional practice had produced. The shift was recognizing God's work, not claiming personal superiority. The fourth challenge is maintaining this consciousness in crisis moments. When emergency hits, when diagnosis comes, when relationship shatters, the instinct is to abandon spiritual recognition and dive into human panic. This is natural, and Joel never condemned it. But he taught that crisis is precisely when recognizing spiritual identity matters most, even if just for moments at a time. Here's the practice. In crisis, you don't need to maintain perfect consciousness for hours. You simply return to recognition repeatedly, even for 30 seconds at a time. Despite this appearance, my spiritual identity remains unchanged. God is present here. I am God's expression now. Then you handle the practical situation. Then you return to recognition again. A father whose child was hospitalized practiced this. He couldn't maintain spiritual consciousness constantly while dealing with doctors and insurance and fear. But dozens of times throughout each day, he would pause for just a few breaths and recognize truth beneath the appearance. This didn't make him passive. It gave him clarity to make better decisions and strength to support his family. After 2 difficult weeks, his child recovered. But the greater transformation was in him. He had proven to himself that spiritual identity could be maintained even in worse circumstances, not perfectly, but sufficiently. This gave him unshakable foundation for future challenges. Joel taught that consciousness developed in crisis becomes permanent strength afterward. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak to your heart and help you maintain spiritual identity despite obstacles, like to support this transformative content, subscribe for advanced spiritual practices from Joel Goldsmith's wisdom, and comment, which obstacle are you ready to transform right now through recognition of your true nature? Let's explore advanced integration of this consciousness in daily life. Joel taught that recognizing yourself as God's child isn't just for meditation time. It transforms how you work, relate, create, and serve. When you go to work tomorrow from the consciousness of spiritual completeness, everything about your approach changes. You're no longer trying to prove your worth or earn approval. A corporate executive applied this teaching to high-pressure presentations. Previously, she prepared from anxiety about judgment and fear of failure. After embracing her identity as God's spiritual expression, she prepared from consciousness of already being complete. The preparation became joyful rather than stressful. She stopped second-guessing every word. The transformation in her presentations was remarkable. Colleagues noticed increased confidence without arrogance, clarity without rigidity. She fielded challenging questions from peace rather than defensiveness. Within a year, she received promotion, but more importantly, she stopped living for external validation. Her sense of worth came from spiritual identity, making success a natural byproduct rather than desperate goal. This is practical mysticism, bringing eternal truth into temporal activity. You don't separate spiritual identity from daily work. Every task becomes opportunity to express the divine consciousness you are. Every interaction becomes chance to recognize God's presence in yourself and others. This isn't adding spiritual practice to busy life. It's recognizing spiritual reality as the foundation of all life. Joel taught that relationships transform completely when you recognize spiritual identity in yourself and others. Most relationships operate from mutual need. I need you to make me feel worthy. You need me to make you feel loved. This creates dependency and eventual disappointment because no human can complete another human. But when you know yourself as God's complete child, relationships become sharing rather than seeking. A marriage on the verge of divorce illustrates this. Both partners were demanding the other change, fix them, complete them. When the wife discovered Joel's teachings, she stopped seeing her husband as failing to meet her needs and began recognizing him as God's spiritual child, even while he still acted from human patterns. She stopped trying to change him. This wasn't passive acceptance of harmful behavior. She maintained healthy boundaries. But her consciousness toward him shifted from judgment to recognition. She no longer needed him to be different for her to be okay, because her completeness came from spiritual identity. This energetic shift changed everything between them over several months. As she stopped emanating demands and disappointment, he naturally began responding differently. He felt space to change without being forced. Within a year, they had completely rebuilt their marriage, not through couples therapy or communication techniques, but through one person consistently recognizing spiritual truth beneath human appearances. Joel called this beholding the Christ in everyone, which dissolves discord naturally. Financial consciousness transforms radically when you stop being a sinner and become God's child. Most people approach money from consciousness of lack, unworthiness, and separation from supply. They work frantically to create abundance through human effort alone, or they pray desperately for God to send them money, reinforcing the very sense of separation that blocks demonstration. Joel taught that abundance is spiritual reality before its physical manifestation. When you recognize yourself as the expression of infinite consciousness, you recognize that infinite supply is your spiritual nature. You don't seek abundance. You recognize it as already present in consciousness. Then you take inspired action from that recognition rather than desperate action from fear of lack. A single mother struggling financially practiced this daily. Before looking at bills or bank statements, she spent time recognizing her spiritual identity as expression of infinite supply. She didn't deny the physical lack, but she refused to build her consciousness on it. She looked from truth toward appearance rather than from appearance toward truth. The shift took 3 months of consistent practice. First, anxiety about money decreased, giving her clearer thinking. Then small, unexpected income appeared. Then a much better job opportunity. Within 6 months, she was financially stable. But the permanent transformation was consciousness. She now understood that supply flows from spiritual recognition, not from human struggle. This understanding served her for decades afterward, through various circumstances. Health consciousness is perhaps where this teaching demonstrates most powerfully. Joel healed countless people not through treating disease but through revealing spiritual identity. When you stop identifying as sick body trying to become healthy and instead recognize yourself as spiritual being, temporarily experiencing physical discord, everything shifts. The body is effect, not cause. A man with serious heart condition was told surgery was inevitable. Before scheduling it, he spent 6 weeks in intensive practice of recognizing his spiritual identity. Not visualizing healthy heart, not affirming healing, not begging God for miracle. Simply resting in recognition that his true identity was spiritual, whole, and complete in God's consciousness, regardless of body's current appearance. He also followed medical advice and made practical lifestyle changes, but from consciousness of completeness rather than fear of death. When he returned for pre-surgery evaluation, his condition had improved so significantly that doctors postponed surgery to monitor. After 3 more months of practice combined with medical care, surgery was deemed unnecessary. The doctors called it spontaneous improvement. Joel would say consciousness changed and body followed. This doesn't mean abandoning medical care or that everyone heals physically. It means your primary identity is spiritual, and maintaining that recognition creates the consciousness in which healing can manifest. Sometimes quickly, sometimes gradually, sometimes in ways unexpected, but always in response to consciousness. As we approach the culmination of this teaching, understand that what Joel Goldsmith revealed isn't another technique to get things from God. It's recognition of what eternally is. You haven't been working toward becoming God's child through these practices. You've been removing the false beliefs that obscured what you always were. This is uncovering, not creating. Recognizing, not achieving. Every moment you've spent in this consciousness, you haven't been improving yourself. You've been seeing yourself correctly for the first time. The peace you feel isn't peace you generated. It's the natural state of your being when false identity drops away. The transformations aren't rewards for good practice. They're the natural demonstration of consciousness aligned with truth. This realization liberates you from the endless seeking that characterizes most spiritual paths. You're not on a journey to reach God. You're awakening to the truth that you never left. God didn't create you as sinner who must earn way back to grace. God created you as spiritual offspring, and that has never changed despite anything you've thought, done, or experienced. The implications are staggering. If your true identity is established by God and unchangeable by human experience, then guilt about the past loses its power. Fear of the future loses its grip. Need for external validation disappears. You rest in consciousness of being, and from that consciousness, you live, move, create, love, heal, and serve. This is freedom beyond anything religion typically offers. Joel spent his final years emphasizing that this consciousness must be lived, not just understood intellectually. Knowledge of spiritual identity means nothing if you return to sinner consciousness the moment you close the spiritual book. The transformation comes from consistent, moment-by-moment return to recognition, especially when everything in you wants to return to old patterns of guilt, fear, and separation. Here's what daily life looks like from this consciousness. You wake recognizing yourself as God's expression before identifying with the person in the mirror. You approach your day's activities as opportunities to let divine intelligence operate through you, rather than problems you must solve through limited human thinking. You meet people recognizing spiritual identity in them beneath their human behavior. When challenge arises, your first response becomes recognition rather than panic. When success comes, you receive it as natural demonstration of consciousness rather than personal achievement to defend. When failure appears, you don't build identity around it. You acknowledge the experience while maintaining recognition of unchanging spiritual truth. This becomes natural with practice, not forced or rigid. A practitioner of 20 years said the greatest shift was that spiritual recognition moved from something she did to something she lived from. It became her default consciousness rather than special practice. She no longer needed to work at remembering who she was. She simply knew, and from that knowing, everything else followed naturally and beautifully, even in difficult circumstances. The final integration is recognizing this truth isn't just personal. When you know yourself as God's spiritual child, you begin recognizing the same truth in everyone you encounter. The difficult colleague isn't just irritating personality. They're God's spiritual offspring, temporarily lost in false identity. The homeless person isn't just unfortunate circumstance. They're divine expression having temporary human experience. This doesn't mean you condone harmful behavior or enable dysfunction. But your consciousness toward others changes from judgment to recognition. You see beyond appearance to spiritual reality. This silent recognition has power to awaken others because consciousness is contagious. When you stand firmly in recognition of truth, others feel it even without words. Joel called this the highest form of prayer, beholding spiritual identity in everyone. A teacher practiced this with troubled students. Instead of seeing them as problems to fix, she silently recognized their spiritual nature while setting appropriate boundaries. Over the school year, dramatic transformations occurred in students everyone else had given up on, not through lectures, but through consciousness. This is how you change the world, not by trying to fix everyone, not by forcing spiritual truth on others, but by living so completely from recognition of divine presence in yourself that your consciousness illuminates truth for those ready to see it. You become living testimony that human identity is illusion and spiritual identity is eternal fact. So what happens when you stop being a sinner and become God's child? Everything changes because your consciousness changes. Not someday in distant future, not after years of spiritual practice, but in this moment when recognition dawns. You realize you've been complete all along, seeking what you already possessed, trying to earn what was freely given before time began. The transformation isn't from bad person to good person. It's from false identity to true identity, from living as if separated from God to recognizing yourself as expression of God, from begging for what you think you lack to recognizing the infinite present where you are. This is Joel Goldsmith's eternal message, as relevant today as when he first taught it decades ago. Your work now is simply this: return to recognition. When you forget and fall into old patterns of guilt, fear, or separation, don't condemn yourself. That's just more sinner consciousness. Instead, gently recognize truth again. I am God's spiritual child. This is established fact. Nothing changes this. Return to this recognition 1,000 times daily if necessary, until it becomes your natural consciousness. From this consciousness, you live freely, you create joyfully, you love completely, you serve naturally, you heal authentically. Not because you're trying to be spiritual, but because you're expressing what you are. This is the secret that changes everything. You already are what you've been seeking to become. Welcome home to your true identity as God's beloved, complete, eternal spiritual offspring. If your spiritual understanding has expanded and your consciousness transformed through these Joel Goldsmith secrets, like this video to help others discover their true identity beyond sin and separation. Subscribe for more transformative teachings that reveal spiritual reality, and comment, I am God's child, to confirm and activate your recognition of eternal truth right now.